Greetings from NASPA. My name is Meents-DeCaigny, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President at DePaul University. I also serve on behalf of NASPA as the Professional Standards Division Liaison to the Knowledge Community. Today I'm here to present the Student Affairs Professional Competency Areas, a foundation for creating and sharing knowledge. This presentation is part of the New Knowledge Community Leader Orientation. And as part of the presentation today, we'll be sharing information about the professional competencies, as well as the recent revisions to the competencies, and also providing a few questions and suggestions for the knowledge communities, and particularly for the knowledge community leaders. To begin, I wanted to share a little bit of the history of the professional competencies. And as many of you may know, but in 2010, ACPA and NASPA came together to develop and approve the professional competencies for our student affairs profession. The competencies were developed to define a broad set of definitions that define knowledge, skills, and at that time attitudes that are expected of student affairs professionals. The intent was that these professional competencies could be used for programming, educational programming, whether it be at the regional level, the national level, or an institutional level. They also it was hopeful that they would be used at the individual professional level, as well as for graduate programming education. When the professional competencies were originally approved, NASPA and ACPA agreed that it would be wise or helpful to review the competencies every 5 years, which is what recently occurred. So in July of 2015, a revised set of competencies were approved by both boards. And as a result, kind of the overarching revisions that took place were that the original 10 competencies remain. They stayed with us. There were 2 competencies that were combined into one, and 2 competencies were renamed, as well as 1 new competency added to our set. For those of you who are visual learners, much like myself, here is a visual of what our new competencies look like. As you can see, there are 10 of them, and I will delve more deeply into some of the revisions, but just to highlight the renaming, you can see that advising and helping has been changed to advising and supporting, and that equity, diversity, and inclusion, the name has been changed to social justice and inclusion. And then the 2 other changes at the bottom, combining personal foundations and ethical practices into personal and ethical foundations, and then the addition of a technology competency. Now to give you a little more detail about some of the more significant revisions to the previous document. First, there's social justice and inclusion. Previously titled, as you saw, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The changes to this competency were made for a variety of reasons. First, as is mentioned here, a shift from the awareness of diversity to a more active orientation, as well as bringing this competency more in line with research practice and commonly utilized definition of social justice. And lastly, the concepts of equity, diversity, and inclusion are integrated into this more active framework of social justice. So, for the purposes of this competency area, social justice is defined as both a process and a goal, which includes the knowledge, skills, and dispositions needed to create learning environments that foster equitable participation of all groups while seeking to address and acknowledge issues of oppression, privilege, and power. So this was probably one of the most significant revision to our competencies in the last year. A next significant change was the addition of a new competency, technology. In the previous competency document, technology was considered a thread woven throughout all the competencies and not a separate area in and of itself. However, since 2010, both NASPA and ACPA had received requests to consider technology as its own competency, and so this revision process allowed to look further into creating technology as a competency. So since technology has emerged as a distinct professional competency over the past 10 years, it was determined that we should also have a competency of technology in our profession. And this idea of technology is twofold: focus on applications to the holistic developmental work of student affairs educator, and focus on innovation. So the competency focuses on the use of digital tools, resources, and technologies for the advancement of student learning, development, and success, as well as the improved performance of student affairs professionals. So included within the areas are of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that lead to the generation of digital literacy and digital citizenship. Next, another change within the professional competencies is related to the personal and ethical foundations. Whereas personal foundations and ethical and professional practice were separate in the previous document, they've now been combined into one. And this area looks at the conceptual convergence and interdependence of those two areas. So the idea is that these two areas are stronger together than on their own. And this competency involves knowledge, skills, and dispositions to develop and maintain integrity in one's life and work. It includes thoughtful development, critique, and adherence to a holistic and comprehensive standard of ethics and commitment to one's own wellness and personal growth. The last area of change that I would like to bring to your attention is related to what was formerly known as the advising and helping competency, now the advising and supporting competency. The emphasis here was really, or the reason here for changing this competency was to emphasize the agency of college students in their development of self-authorship, and also distancing student affairs educators from directive or service-oriented roles related to advising. And again, the way the revisions were written underscores the importance of the relationship and the way in which, as student affairs professionals, we facilitate those advising and supporting relationships with students and groups. So the competency, the newer competency, now addresses knowledge, skills, and dispositions related to providing advising and support to individuals and groups through direction, feedback, critique, referral, and guidance, and is less maybe connected to direct advising as it might have been thought of in the past document. Seeing our revised list of competencies, I'd like to touch on a few more of them and give you an idea of the types of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that are included. For instance, assessment, evaluation, and research, one of my favorites, focuses on the ability to design, conduct, critique, and use various assessment, evaluation, and research methodologies and the results obtained from them to utilize assessment, evaluation, research processes and their results in order to inform practice. There's also knowledge, skills, and dispositions incorporated that talk about shaping the political and ethical climate related to assessment, evaluation, and research processes in higher education. Another area, values, philosophy, and history, addresses knowledge, skills, and dispositions that connect the history, philosophy, and values of our profession to one's current professional practice. This competency area embodies the foundations of the profession from which current and future research, scholarship, and practice will change and grow. Law, policy, and government, another competency, includes knowledge, skills, and dispositions relating to policy development processes used in various contexts, as well as the application of legal constructs, compliance and policy issues, and the understanding of governance structures and their impact on one's professional practice. Lastly, I want to touch on leadership as an example. And this area addresses knowledge, skills, and dispositions required of a leader with or without positional authority. Leadership involves both the individual role of a leader and the leadership process of individuals working together to envision, plan, and affect change in organizations and respond to the broad-based constituencies and other issues. I will touch on a few more of these competencies in depth in a moment, but now I'd like to talk a little bit about how each competency is structured as far as outcomes and levels. So first, within each competency, there are knowledge, skills, and dispositions that are outlined relating to the learning and the development that has been defined for professionals in our field. And dispositions I highlight here because in the previous document we used the term attitudes, but dispositions has been selected, and here's just a brief explanation, because it encompasses attitudes, values, and beliefs. And it also is more related to habits of the mind that filter our knowledge, skills, and beliefs. And so dispositions is the language that we use now, and it also highlights the expectations we have for professionals in regards to attitudes, values, and beliefs. The next piece related to structure is around outcome levels. In the previous document, we talked about beginner and intermediate and advanced outcome levels. And now the first level is defined as foundational, really because we talk about and we frame those outcomes as foundational outcomes that we would look to all student affairs professionals to try and achieve. And they're really the foundation that the other two levels are built on within each competency area. So now taking a little bit of a closer look at two competency areas so that you can get a feel for what those outcomes might look like at the various levels. I chose advising and support as one. So again, just very generally, this particular competency addresses knowledge, skills, and dispositions related to providing advising and support to individuals and groups. And at the foundational level, one of the outcomes you will find is knowledge and use of referral sources and exhibit referral skills in seeking expert assistance. Know and use referral sources. So you can see as a new professional in the field, this would be a very foundational outcome that we would like professionals to have as they begin working in their particular area or with their particular responsibilities. As an intermediate outcome, we have assessed the developmental needs of students and organizational needs of student groups. So you move from knowing about resources and being able to seek assistance from experts to being able to assess what the needs are of students and of organizations you might work with. And in the advanced area, again, it's assessing responses to advising and supporting interventions, including traditional campus-based and virtual interventions. So this is looking at once having implemented interventions, then being able to assess what those responses were to the types of interventions that were utilized. Next, I'd like to take a closer look at student learning and development as one of our competencies. Again, the overarching idea of student learning and development is addressing knowledge, skills, and abilities related to concepts and principles of student development and learning theory. So at a foundational level, one of our competencies is to identify one's own informal theories. I love this foundational outcome. The theories in use and how they can be informed by formal theories to enhance work with students. And so this is a foundational piece to draw our attention to. We may have our own informal theories, but looking to the formal theories in our field and relating them to the work that we do, which is very important. At the intermediate level, we're talking about utilizing theory to practice models to inform individual or unit practice. So again, it's an increased knowledge of the theory in order to then connect the theory to our practice. And those are more formal theories, not the informal theories. And at the advanced level, to utilize theory to inform divisional and institutional policy and practice. So you can also see that this these levels expand from a focus on an individual's practice to a divisional or institutional level of policy and practice, and even of influence. So, having our 10 competencies and having the levels within each competency is important. But I also want to draw your attention to this newer, this beautiful visual that is included in the new document that illustrates how the competencies intersect with one another. In the previous document, we had kind of 4 areas that we talked about, threads that would weave through each of the competency areas. But now the emphasis is on the intersection of the 10 competency areas. So for each of the 10 competency areas, there's a distinct central idea that differentiates it from the other 9 areas. But that said, there's also significant overlap and intersection among the outcomes associated with the various competency areas. So this visual is to remind us that while there are specific outcomes within each competency area, there is much overlap. And so we need to keep that in mind, especially as we look at our own professional development, that if we're if we're developing competencies in one area, it's likely that it may also contribute to another competency area. I also just want to draw your attention to these 3 points of emphasis on the left of the screen, because it's highlighted along with the competencies that there are these 3 points of emphasis identified for the competencies, and those are globalism, sustainability, and collaboration. So none of these 3 points of emphasis stands alone on its own as a distinct competency, but they're very important to the work that we do and their connection to the various competencies. So they're to be thought of as kind of points of emphasis throughout the competencies. Next, I just want to highlight really quick that each of our professional icons, and these are newly revised icons, each of our professional competencies have an icon to go with it. And so when you're looking at publications, and hopefully when you're looking online at newer publications, you will see an indication of what professional competency might be related. So for example, in the annual conference publication, next to each presentation is usually an icon that indicates to what competency it may contribute. So it's just a point of awareness, and these icons are usually listed within the publication, so you don't have to memorize them. But it's important just for your own knowing how they're connected to the professional competencies, especially within the KCs. How can you possibly use these competencies to let your members or others know to which competency your work might be related? And I'll come back to that point in just a moment. So some questions and suggestions to consider, particularly for the knowledge communities, since this is related to training for knowledge community leaders. Some questions to ask yourself and your leadership team is, how is your knowledge community currently incorporating the professional competencies into your work? This is a question we've been talking about throughout the last 6 months or so with the knowledge communities. And it's important to really take some time to familiarize yourself with the competencies and then look at the work that your knowledge community is doing in order to see where there are connections and where there can be tighter connections in the future. And that kind of leads to the second question of how can your knowledge community incorporate the competencies in the future, particularly related to creating new knowledge. So each knowledge community is asked to use the competencies as a framework for their KC publication article each year. So that's one way your knowledge community will connect to the professional competencies, but what are the other ways that you are or that you can in the future connect to the competencies? Some other examples are listed down here as far as frameworking any professional development webinars that you do, how you can identify what competency they're related to, as well as using the competencies or connecting the competencies to social media communications or other communications. That's where those icons maybe come in handy. Also, how you select programs, whether a pre-conference program that you're looking to nominate or select your 3 programs for the national conference, to use the professional competencies as a guide for what type of programs you might select for those types of events. A few other suggestions, these came from conversations we had with knowledge communities recently. One is to insert a link to the professional competencies on your KC website if it doesn't already exist there somewhere, to raise awareness for your members. Also, as I mentioned, to look at what kind of programs and events you're doing, what initiatives do you currently have that could be intentionally connected to professional competencies. Another idea is to really focus in, as new leaders of the knowledge community, what 2 or 3 professional competencies can your or will your KC intentionally focus on and connect to during your leadership time. And then hopefully the next set of leaders will focus on other professional competencies, so you continue to develop all the competency areas or look at the various competency areas for your members. And lastly, a suggestion that came about is to potentially add responsibilities for professional competencies to an existing leadership position in your leadership team, or to maybe develop a new position that really focuses on the competencies and how it relates to the work of your knowledge community. Lastly, I just want to highlight a couple of resources. As I mentioned, the professional competencies are housed with the Professional Standards Division within NASPA. And so the website for the Professional Standards Division is the first link here. And the resource page where you can find examples of how people are using the resources is also listed here. So I would encourage you to take a look at one or either of these links. And again, this is where you'll find a link to the professional competencies to connect to your KC leadership, to your knowledge community site. As I wrap up, I want to thank you for your time and attention. I hope this has been helpful to you and will help inform your work as a knowledge community leader in the near future. And I also want to let you know, if you have questions, please feel free to contact Stephanie Reynolds at the national office or myself. My email address is listed here as well. So I thank you, and I wish you all the best as you begin your KC leadership position.